Hi there and welcome to the first episode of the Commodore 64 Budget Publisher Showdown. In this new 5-part series I'm going to be taking a look at the 3 most prolific publishers for budget games on the Commodore 64, Mastertronic, Firebird and Codemasters, and trying to work out which of those was best. But I'm not going to be doing it alone. So we've got lots to get through in this episode, so let's get it on. Let's start things off by taking a look at the format and rules for this competition. The competition is going to feature 16 rounds over 5 episodes, each featuring a game from each publisher in a variety of categories, for example platformers, shooters, sports and puzzle games, but much more besides that. I've chosen what I consider to be the best game from each of the 3 publishers in each category, based on my own personal experience for Mastertronic and Firebird games, having played virtually all of them, and then for Codemasters it's a mixture of personal experience and also going from magazine reviews and Lemon 64 scores to try and identify the best game from that publisher. All the games are budget originals with no re-releases allowed except for one category. There's also no arcade conversions allowed, which discounts a few games from Mastertronic and one from Firebird. In each episode I'll be joined by 2 knowledgeable guests from other YouTube channels or the Commodore 64 scene. Each of us will give our thoughts on the 3 games in each category and then rank them from 3rd to 1st place. First place gets 3 points, 2nd gets 2 and 3rd gets 1. The points will then be tallied up to determine the winner of each round and ultimately the overall best publisher across all 16 rounds. So that was the format of the contest. Now let's move on to introduce the 3 companies competing to become the best Commodore 64 budget publisher. First up in the blue corner is Mastertronic, and at this point I'd like to give a mention to the former financial controller of Mastertronic, Anthony Guter, whose site has a wealth of information and was the source of several of the images I'm about to display. His site is www.guter.org and I'll put a link to that in the video description. Mastertronic was founded in 1983 by Martin Alper, Frank Herman, Terry Medway and Alan Sharam. The company pioneered the budget computer software industry, offering a large range of games at the previously unheard of price of £1.99. Rather than sell these through typical computer shops, they initially created dealer packs of 100 tapes and sold them to locations such as newsagents, toy shops and petrol stations, targeting kids that would make impulse pocket money purchases. After some initial success, they later achieved wider distribution of the range by selling them through major chain stores such as Woolworths and Boots. Mastertronic never employed in-house programmers to write games. Everything was produced either by software houses or freelance authors. At that time, hundreds of bedroom programmers were trying to get rich quickly by writing games, and much of the early output was supplied by the Darling brothers, more on them later, and Mr. Chip Software. The early Mastertronic range was marketed in their iconic grid-backed packaging with attractive cover artwork. This consistent and distinctive branding made their games instantly recognisable. They were also one of the first publishers to use colour coding to denote which system the game was for, with red indicating Commodore 64, yellow the Spectrum and orange for the Amstrad. This standard would later be adopted by other budget publishers. In late 1985, Mastertronic launched their Mastertronic's Added Dimension label, or MAD for short. This was devised so that they could sell games with more depth or longevity at the slightly higher price of £2.99. As the business continued to grow, Mastertronic created another label in 1986, Entertainment USA, designed to promote games from American programmers such as Sculptured Software. A year later, the Bulldog brand was created primarily to distribute the best of British games in the US, though they were also sold in this packaging in the UK. Another notable change in late 1986 was the move away from the grid branding of the core range and the comic book styling of the MAD label, with a new packaging design being introduced that gave a more consistent style to both brands, with only the MAD logo and price point distinguishing between them. Further packaging design revisions would occur over the next few years as the company faced competition from other budget game publishers. In 1987, the re-release label Ricochet was launched, under which the company gave budget releases to games from other companies including Activision, Ultimate and Martech. Later, a buyout of Melbourne House when that label was suffering financial problems enabled them to add games such as Way of the Exploding Fist to their re-release catalogue. Additionally, several labels were invented for other publishers who wanted Mastertronic to reissue their older games at budget prices, such as Racket for Houston and Americana for US Gold. In early 1987, Mastertronic became the main UK distributor for Sega's Master System range and were later appointed as distributors in France and Germany too, the result being that Sega Europe was born. By 1988, the Mastertronic group was experiencing severe cash flow problems, so Virgin Games stepped in and purchased 45% of the company's shares. The merger created Virgin Mastertronic, but the company would continue to publish budget titles under the Mastertronic brand for several more years. Another rebranding occurred at this point, with the majority of games being sold under the Mastertronic Plus banner for $2.99. Soon after the completion of the merger, the budget side of the business began to decline as companies like Ocean and US Gold began publishing their old full-price games in the Hit Squad and Kicks ranges. Sega sales were booming too, and so the majority of the staff moved over to Sega when they took over the business from Virgin in the early 90s, effectively bringing the Mastertronic era to an end. Over a 6-year period, Mastertronic published more than 200 budget games for the Commodore 64, with over 140 of them being original titles. Many of their most popular games sold over 150,000 copies across all formats. The story doesn't quite end there though, as in 2003 Frank Herman, one of the founders of the original Mastertronic, was involved in negotiations to buy back the name from Sega. The new Mastertronic group was founded in 2004 and published low-priced PC games under a variety of labels, including Sold Out, Mad and Great Indie Games. That final incarnation of Mastertronic closed in 2015. In the red corner is Firebird. Firebird software was one of several brands used by Telecomsoft, the software publishing division of British Telecom. The company was founded in 1984 when games were the fastest growing sector within the computer software market. BT brought in Tony Rainbird, owner of budget software publisher Microgold, to help set up Firebird software. Throughout the company's life, Firebird published games at a variety of price points. The first budget titles were released on the Firebird Silver label in November 1984, priced at £2.50. The games had distinctive packaging with a mostly white cover that showed a large screenshot of the game. This was seen as a unique selling point at the time, and the games were advertised in magazines with the slogan "Seeing is Believing." Much like Mastertronic, the majority of Firebird's budget games were programmed by freelancers, from one-man bedroom coders to small independent software houses. The Firebird Silver releases were highly successful, and in February 1985, for example, Booty was the third best-selling video game in the UK, behind only Ghostbusters and Daley Thompson's Decathlon. In late 1985, the budget range was relaunched as the lower-priced Firebird Silver 199 range to compete with Mastertronic's popular £1.99 titles. The cassette inlays were redesigned to show more attractive wraparound artwork, but still showed game screenshots on the back. During this period, a small number of £2.99 games were also released in slightly more lavish-looking gold-adorned packaging. In 1987, Firebird began re-releasing games from other publishers, most notably Activision, including several of their games that had never received a full-price release in the UK. In early 1988, to avoid confusion with their full-price software, Telecomsoft decided to rebrand the Silver 199 range as Silverbird. Two price points were established for 8-bit software, £1.99 and £2.99, and were differentiated between by their own particular style of packaging. Silverbird published a range of titles that hadn't previously been released at budget price, including new original titles, several of which were developed by Probe Software. They also continued to release older full-price titles acquired from publishers such as Palace Software and Mirrorsoft. Despite a turnover of over £6 million in 1988, BT decided to move away from the computer market, and Telecomsoft was sold to Microprose in 1989 in a deal reported to be worth around £2 million. The budget Silverbird label was subsequently sold to Tudor Enterprises, a British publisher. They published a compilation pack of old Silverbird titles and a small number of other games before closing down their software publishing operations, bringing the Firebird budget range to an end in 1990. Across their various packaging styles, Firebird published over 100 games for the Commodore 64 between 1984 and 1989, with more than 75% of these being original titles. And in the yellow corner, the longest lasting of the three publishers, Codemasters. Codemasters was founded by brothers Richard and David Darling in 1986. The Darling brothers started writing video games on a Commodore PET in their home in Vancouver, Canada in the early 80s, and continued when they moved to the UK to live with their grandparents. They created a number of VIC-20 games which they duplicated themselves and sold via small adverts in magazines such as Popular Computing Weekly. In 1982 they formed the company Galactic Software, and 2 years later they began to provide games to be published by Mastertronic, including Spacewalk, BMX Racers, the infamous Bionic Granny, and later Chiller, The Last V8 and Master of Magic. By the time they were aged 16 and 17, the brothers had earned over £200,000 in royalties from their games, and in March 1986 they broke their contract with Mastertronic to become independent. In October of that year, the Darling brothers founded Codemasters with help from their father Jim. Initially, the company concentrated on budget games at the $1.99 and later $2.99 price point for 8-bit home computers. The first game was Bmx Simulator, developed by Richard. According to David, the company aimed to create budget-priced games with the quality of full-price games. To produce more games in less time, Codemasters hired developers on a freelance basis. Most notable amongst these was another pair of brothers, the Oliver twins, who were responsible for Super Robin Hood, Ghost Hunters and the hugely successful Dizzy series. Thanks in part to Dizzy, Codemasters became known for cute character-driven platform games, along with their large range of sports simulators and top-down multiplayer racing games. Like other budget publishers, their games were sold in a consistent packaging design and often had cartoonish artwork on the covers. The company also had a slightly dubious reputation for bigging up their own games by putting quotes from David Darling on the inlays saying things like "absolutely brilliant." The distinctive packaging stayed largely the same throughout the life of the budget range. Within its first year of trading, Codemasters was the best-selling game publisher in Britain, with in excess of 27% of the total market according to the Gallup charts of the time. The company produced around 100 games for the Commodore 64 between 1986 and 1993, almost all of which were original titles. As the 8-bit computer market diminished, Codemasters turned to developing for the console markets. They had major success with the Micro Machines series on the Sega Mega Drive, which continued their legacy of top-down multiplayer racing games. Another success was the Game Genie, a cheat cartridge for the NES released in the US by Galoob. They were also one of the few companies to help inflict a rare courtroom defeat on Nintendo, who unsuccessfully sued Galoob, claiming that the Game Genie created derivative works in violation of copyright law. Codemasters has continued to release titles for most popular consoles over the last 30 years, with the majority being racing games such as the Colin McRae Rally, Dirt, F1, Project Cars and Toka series. The Darlings sold their stake in the company in 2007, but it continued to operate as an independent developer until 2021, when it was taken over and absorbed into the Electronic Arts monolith. So that's all the formalities done with. Let's get episode 1 of the Budget Publisher Showdown underway. In this first episode we're going to be looking at a variety of shooters, and to help me review and rank them I'm delighted to welcome two highly decorated veterans of the C64 scene, Matt Allen and Warren Pilkington.
Hello. Hello.
Okay, so before we move on to the reviews and things like that, perhaps you'd like to tell us a little bit about yourselves, just for those people who aren't aware of you. Matt, do you want to go first?
Sure. Hi there, my name is Matt Allen from Cheam, studying chemical engineering. Wrong show introduction there. Many of you online probably also know me as Mayhem. There's plenty of places that handle's used around. Or the guy who probably outbid you on eBay. In my spare time, I help moderate Lemon 64 and elsewhere. I'm part of the Game-Based 64 Preservation Project. And I write reviews and more for the relaunched Zap 64 annuals and magazine from Fusion Retro.
Thank you very much. Warren?
I'm Warren Pilkington. You may know me by my handle of Was. I used to contribute tips and pokes to Zap 64 and then Commodore format, so did that between 1988 and 95, before then taking over being the tip section writer for Commodore Zone for a good few years after that. I also, for many years, contributed to the High Voltage SID collection, HVSC, and I've composed over 150 SID tunes in my time as well. At the moment, I'm a member of the demo group Padua and also write occasional articles for both the Commodore Format Archive and Remix 64 websites.
Thank you very much. You two are way more qualified for this than I am, I have to say, at this point. But I shall do my best to keep up with you. I'd like to add that Warren's known on YouTube as Zor Towers, and he's one of my most loyal subscribers in as much as he comments on nearly all my videos and gives loads of interesting insight into the games I review, and I really appreciate the comments he's made over the last few years. So thanks for your support, Warren, and I hope you'll continue commenting for many years to come. Before we start with the reviews, perhaps you'd like to share a few of your memories about collecting and playing budget games, either back in the day or in the modern era, and your general thoughts on them.
Yeah, budget games usually formed a necessary and vital link for younger players to get hold of certain titles, and it probably gave publishers a quick injection of cash selling a game for a second time. I suppose this isn't completely budget related, apart from the fact in price. It also included those $1.99 label specials in your local corner shop. Getting the old special $1.99 fluorescent blue label on a game that you've been looking for, and then not seeing a review for it and wondering what it was when you got it home was kind of like budget roulette.
Yeah, absolutely.
I generally tried to stick to original budget releases when I bought games, because I usually often got the full price releases, so I didn't really need to get sort of when they were re-released. But needless to say, I did rather get swamped with budget titles when I was reviewing games for Oracle Teletext, their Buzz computer section back in the early 90s. I didn't really complain, because free games for my games collection and the re-releases were pretty easy to write down because I'd already played them, so I could spend more time playing the originals. As for the three publishers we're looking at, to be fair, I don't think I really had a particular favourite out of them. I just bought the games because they were good, whether it was Spore, Thrust or CJ's Elephant Antics, really. I guess this series will try to determine which one of them was best overall.
Yeah, that's definitely the plan. We'll see how that goes as the series progresses. Warren, your thoughts on the budget gaming era?
Yeah, so I mean, actually, before I had my 64, I did have a Commodore Plus 4 for a couple of years, and obviously you appreciated the fact that you could buy games cheaply. Mastertronic particularly supported that format really well, so it was a case of going to your computer game shop or your local newsagent that would have all of the racks of games there, and you could buy them. And obviously when I moved to the 64, you know, a lot of the similar type of games were in the same sort of shop, so you could basically look at games by Mastertronic, Firebird, and then later on Codemasters. And you may not have necessarily seen the game review before buying the games. You were literally sometimes just chancing your arm thinking, this might look decent. Is it going to be a good game? And when you got home and you had something that was actually really playable, you really enjoyed it. And you were like, oh, I've only paid £2 for this. This is not bad at all. But I think for those where money was tight, they were able to play games and not feel they were priced out of the games industry. And I think that was really important for a lot of people. So the sales figures, particularly of some Mastertronic titles, really backed that up as well. They sold like 400,000 across all formats of Formula 1 Simulator. So clearly they were doing something right and people were buying the games. I think the other thing as well, what was notable back in the day, I think for a lot of these games was you knew you weren't going to get necessarily massive longevity out of a lot of them, but when you had a game that had a massive amount of gameplay and you were there playing it for hours, you really appreciated it for the price, because like Hero of the Golden Talisman is massive in terms of its map and size, and you could spend a good few hours on one go trying to get through the game. So at least there was some longevity in that. So I think people have this kind of misassumption that every budget game was like a sort of games creator special static screen dullness.
Well, the early Mastertronic ones were.
They were, and unfortunately that reputation stuck with them all the way through when it perhaps wasn't deserved. You've touched on a good point there about you not seeing the reviews beforehand and just picking a game maybe based on the front cover or the screenshots. And my experience is that budget games tended to be sort of a 50-50 shot on whether you got a good game or not, and my reviews of Mastertronic and the Firebird range have sort of backed that up. Is roughly 1 in 2 games was decent, and that's actually quite good because everyone used to say they were quite terrible games and all called Mastertronic, Masterchronic and things like that, but actually they had a lot better games than perhaps the reputation sort of said at the time.
Yeah, I think you kind of took your chance with that, didn't you? You were like, well, is it going to be decent? Well, we'll get home and find out. And I think even if it wasn't, say, the best game ever, but it was still playable, maybe your opinion changed because you've only paid £2 for the game.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree totally with that. Thanks very much, both of you, for your thoughts about the budget gaming era. Let's now move on to the main reason we're here, which is to talk about 9 games from 3 different publishers across 3 categories. As I mentioned, this episode of the show is all about shooters, and our first round is about space shooters. So any shooters that take place in space, they can be horizontal or vertically scrolling. The only real prerequisite is you shoot stuff and it's in space. And the 3 games we're going to look at in this round, firstly representing Mastertronic is Sidewinder 2, then representing Firebird is Warhawk, and finally representing Codemasters is Poltergeist. So first up we have Sidewinder 2. This is a 1990 Mastertronic Plus release that retailed at £2.99, and this is a vertically scrolling shoot 'em up programmed by PAL Developments with music by Julian Potts. This one's got a pretty generic sci-fi plot. After 27 years of peace in the western spiral arm of the galaxy, long-range detectors are sensing a massive battle station approaching from the direction of the alien homeworld. As a veteran of the original Sidewinder mission, you've been chosen as the only possible candidate to take on this battle station. Access to the battle station is via a tunnel used to vent any excess energy. Lining the tunnel are defensive positions which may be destroyed. There are also maintenance and defense drones patrolling the duct watching for faults and space scavengers. To help you on your mission, extra weaponry will be ported in, so watch out for these and collect them. So my thoughts on Sidewinder 2. I don't think it was a bad game. It's fairly playable. It's not particularly remarkable for a 1990 game. There's definitely a lot of shooters that have been done before and after that on the Commodore 64 that were way better, but I didn't think it was too bad. It's got a nice title screen with a scrolling background story, a little bit like a Star Wars scroll maybe, and a decent SID tune. Graphics pretty generic, I would say, and repetitive from one level to the next. As far as I could tell, it was mainly just like a palette swap with the same sprites and the same background tiles. The in-game sound effects are also pretty basic. What I did think was interesting about this game though was the scrolling, the fact that you could speed it up by pushing towards the top of the screen. You could also stop it dead by bringing your ship right to the bottom, which made me wonder if it might have a bit of an influence from River Raid of all things, because you could sort of control the speed of your movement in that. In terms of the gameplay, mostly static gun emplacements and barriers to shoot and tunnels to navigate, not too many flying ships coming towards you, which again kind of reminded me of River Raid a little bit, where you're having to negotiate around the landscape more so than actually shoot things. Power-ups were pretty varied. You've got speed up, multi-way fire, drones that follow you around, things like that. There were a few big ships, but no real end of level bosses, which was a bit of a shame. You just kind of drifted to the end of a level and move on to the next one. But overall, I didn't think it was too bad. Definitely not the best budget shooter out there, but playable, I thought. So Matt, what were your thoughts on the game?
Mostly similar to yours, although the first hot take that I had playing it, and I will admit this is one of the few games that we're covering today that I'd not actually played before, I got the immediate vibe that it was like a hacked Suet game, which possibly is kind of like one of the earliest examples of it. It played very similar and looked very, very similar as if it had been designed in Suet. They plonked a title screen on with title music. They'd obviously hacked it a bit, as you say, to do the scrolling and the added weapons. But just the look and the sound and the feel of the game itself just reminded me of a Suet title, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. There were an awful lot of games made with the construction kit in the late 80s, and a few of them were actually sold at retail. But yeah, it was a reasonable title, but as you say, yeah, it didn't really do anything exciting, and through reviewing it now, I'd probably give it something like about, 65%, something like that.
Yeah, I'd agree totally with that sort of a rating. I thought it was very much a 6 or 7 out of 10 kind of a game. And you're dead right, particularly the sound effects were very reminiscent of a shoot-'em-up construction kit game. Pretty simple sound effects, not much in the way of tunes or anything too spectacular in that respect. Okay, thanks for that. Warren, your thoughts on Sidewinder 2?
I'm siding with the two of you a little bit on this as well, because there were pluses minus points of this game that if it was just a bit better designed, they could have actually made it a sort of 8 or 9 out of 10 game rather than a 6. The actual main ship is well animated. They've actually used sprite overlays on the main ship to make it, look more effective, which was quite good. The title theme from Julian Potts, aka Jackmaster, decent title theme, sets the scene. At least there's a shield bar, so it's not just one hit and you're dead. The only thing was you could only retain one weapon at a time, which, would have been nice if it was progressive, where you could have had, say, maybe 2 or 3 and then maybe lost one when you lost a life. But when you hold down to pause the scrolling, you can't also shoot either. It's just literally a case of pause and look at the landscape and then make a decision to shoot. So I wasn't sure whether that was the intention when they did that. And some of the targets seemed a bit too difficult to hit without sort of colliding with the background while they're trying to do so. So maybe the design just needed a bit of tweaking. It's a fairly reasonable, solid game. I wouldn't probably be too upset if I had to pay the $2.99 for it back in the day, but certainly there are better out there, I would say. But I'd say it was a fairly average release.
If you're wondering why it's called Sidewinder 2, I did a little digging. There is actually a Suet-created Sidewinder game as well. So I'm half wondering if it's meant to be a spiritual successor. And it also made me think, well, the original was made with Suet and it's in game base. Maybe the sequel is actually a hacked Suet game as well. It just gave me another added thought about, yes, it is, but it's got a whole bunch of bells and whistles added to it.
Or did they try and make it a sequel to the classic Amiga Sidewinder game that Mastertronic released? Because that, on the Amiga, is a stone cold classic.
Interesting. Well, we may never know at this point.
Yeah.
It was interesting the point you made, Warren, about not being able to shoot when you were stuck at the bottom of the screen, because on the version I played, I could do that. Now, I wasn't playing an original load, I was playing a cracked version with some infinite lives so that I could get a bit further through the game and film a bit more of it, but that's interesting. So maybe the crackers actually fixed that in that version, I'm not sure.
For pretty much all the games that I hadn't played before that we're covering today, I was actually loading them from the original tape or disc images that were in game base, not the cracks. But I can't answer the question either way, because I don't recall actually ever pulling myself all the way down to the bottom of the screen, because you needed to be some way up to be able to shoot stuff that was coming towards you.
Yeah, I found that there was a bit of a strategy there where if I stuck myself at the bottom of the screen, I could then move left or right and just shoot a big row of the sort of emplacements that are on the side of the walls. So I actually found it quite useful to do that, but maybe that was because my version had been massaged slightly to make it a little bit more playable. We'll probably never know. Well, that was our opinions on Sidewinder 2. So let's move on to the next game, which was Warhawk, released by Firebird Software in their Silver Range packaging in 1986. This was a £1.99 game. It was programmed by Proteus Developments and the music's by the great Rob Hubbard. The aim of the game is to fly the Warhawk into the asteroid belt, destroying the enemy bases and wiping out the marauding hordes of enemy starfighters. The main aim of the game is to destroy all the enemy ground bases, and you'll receive an end of level bonus if you manage to completely wipe out all installations on a base. This game got pretty good reviews across the board when released. Computer and Video Games gave it 7 out of 10. Zap64 said it offered lots of good solid blasting for only £2 and gave it an overall rating of 80%, going on to say it was one of the better shoot-em-ups on the Commodore 64 and one of the cheapest too. And Commodore user gave it a similar score of 8 out of 10, saying a good shoot-em-up is always in demand and at the price they couldn't see why it shouldn't go straight into the top 5. So Matt, what are your thoughts on this one?
Oh boy, Warhawk. Now, the weird thing about this is that I utterly loathe Star Force. Just something about it I do not like in the slightest. However, Warhawk is a Star Force clone, and I utterly love Warhawk. So it's a very, very weird situation. I think it probably helped that Warhawk has got sort of an energy level rather than being a straight one hitting you dead type of thing. So if you make a minor mistake or something like that, you're not losing a life and you're going back to a checkpoint. On the other hand, of course, Warhawk, you've got one life, and once the energy's gone, then that is literally the end of the game. So it's the same gameplay mechanics, really. Different mechanic about sort of handling getting hit by the enemy. I think Warhawk's a lot more fair. It certainly allows you to maneuver and get out of trouble. And they decided to scramble the end of level boss and make it an utter frenzied free-for-all, which really does put the crap up you when you've got like 2 triangles of energy left and you're having to survive all of that. Your fire button on your joystick may not survive it either after hammering it viciously for 30 seconds to then make it through to the end. Rob Hubbard tune is another one of his classics. Obviously, you can't do too much about the fact that it has to drop a voice for the sound effects while you're playing. You just have to accept that. But if you want to listen to it, then you just stay on the title screen. Yeah, Warhawk is, a great game. And honestly, I think, possibly just because it was a clone of what was then a 2-year-old arcade machine when it came out, I think the scores are a little harsh. I would have probably pushed it up, high 80s myself.
Okay, great. So Warren, what about your thoughts on Warhawk?
Now, I never played the arcade machine Star Force, so when I first played Warhawk back in 1986 and 87 time, I just came into it as if it was just like a budget shooter. So in a way, I was not influenced by what the arcade machine it was based on was kind of doing. It's got a good pace to it. It's nice, smooth scrolling, as you'd kind of expect from a 64 shooter, really. The Rob Hubbard music is a real classic Hubbard tune, even though there are bits of it that are lifted from John Keating's Space Experience album. And if you've never heard that, I would recommend you go and have a listen to it, because you can clearly tell where the influence lies. The controls certainly feel responsive as well. You certainly feel like when you are shooting something or someone's trying to get to you and you're dodging it, you certainly feel it's pretty accurate, which is always good to see. The fact that they put the display next to the score for the shield was quite handy to see at the bottom of the screen, so you could easily see what shields you've got left and what actions you might want to take. Whether you play safe and just try and get to the end of the level with the shield you've got left, or whether you try and go for the bonus for destroying all the targets. You had 2 options for a high score challenge as well, which is really nice. And the difficulty curve, I think, was pretty fair. So you always felt like you got a bit further every go as well. So someone's clearly played it enough times and play tested to make sure that you didn't just get to, like, say, one level and could never get past it on the next goes. You always felt like you got a bit further. Some of the bas relief graphics could be a bit better. You could have designed them and had Shook been out then. It does its job, but it's not the best graphics ever. There is only one additional weapon, which I think is from like level 4 onwards, if I remember. So maybe there was a little bit more variety needed. Maybe every couple of levels they gave you a slightly different weapon to sort of use and progress that way. But it is still a budget classic. If you've got $1.99 to spend on a space shooter, then this is quality, no question.
Yeah, to be honest, there's not much more I can say to add to what you guys have said, because I think exactly the same thing. I agree about Star Force. I'm not a fan of it either, but I'm also a fan of Warhawk. It's a very straightforward vertical shooter, but there's just something about it that makes it really playable. The in-game soundtrack I actually found quite a rarity, especially for Firebird games. You usually got sound effects or music, but not both. So although you do lose that channel of the SID due to the sound effects, I still think that's a great addition, and it just makes it, I don't know, just a more enjoyable game because it's got music and sound effects.
I guess I would have liked the option to pick whether you could have had sound effects or in-game music or both when playing the game. Maybe like a sort of sound or music toggle on the title screen to give you the option would have been quite helpful.
I do like that you've still got the sort of bass line, and that kind of propels the game along quite nicely. As you've mentioned, Warren, the scrolling's smooth, the movement of the ship's precise. It's a pretty repetitive game. It doesn't vary much from one level to another, but it's not too hard, it's addictive, and you've got that challenge of clearing all the ground-based targets if you want to try and get the big bonus score at the end. So, as you've both said, it's just a great shooter, and for $1.99 you couldn't really ask for much more, really. So positive views of Warhawk there. Let's move on to the final game in this round, which is Poltergeist, released by Codemasters in 1988 for the price of £1.99. This is a horizontal scroller and was an exclusive to the Commodore 64. Programmed by Gavin Rayburn with music from David Whittaker. You take control of an exorcist spacecraft and you must destroy a poltergeist. Before this though, you have to fly over 32 levels and destroy its minions and generators. After all the generators on a level are destroyed, you need to land on a teleport pad to get to the next level. There are plenty of weapon upgrades to collect to help complete your mission by collecting the power transmuters, and in addition to your weapons you can also activate a freak bomb by pressing the spacebar. It was given a reasonably positive review by Zap. They gave it 66% overall, saying it's a limited but playable shoot 'em up, well worth its titchy price tag. So Warren, what are your thoughts on Poltergeist?
Yeah, so this was a game, as well as Warhawk, this is a game I originally owned first time round. It was a relatively decent budget shooter at the time when I played it. Playing it again, basically most of the same thoughts I had back then stand now. It does scroll well in either direction. There's a lot of action on screen. It gets very frenetic in later levels, should you survive that long, of course, because it is quite difficult. There are different weapons to use, and there are certain weapons that work better than others in certain sections, so you do need to work out what are your best options. The trio weapon tended to be the best a lot of the time, just purely because you had downward diagonal fire to hit some of the ground targets. There are 32 levels. I've hardly seen anyone get past level 15 or 20. It's pretty steep difficulty after about level 10, to be perfectly honest. Interesting note about the level names, most of them are named after music that Gavin Rayburn, the programmer, liked. So some of it's named after Ultravox tracks, some of it's named after Midure tracks, some of it's named after Visage tracks. Speaking to Gavin many years ago, he did tell me he was a big sort of Ultravox and Midure fan, which is why that reference was there. Also, what's quite nice is, when you do lose a life, you don't lose the weapons that you have. So you're not having to start from like no weapons at all, which is at least something. The only minus point that's massive for me really was the fact that there was no in-game display for the score or shields on lives, so you didn't know when you were going to run out of shields, and literally you could just be flying around thinking you're doing okay, and all of a sudden, wham, you're dead, you know. And that was a little bit of an oversight. They could have maybe put a display in the top or bottom border just to make it a bit clearer. And the weapon select system is also dreadfully bad. You've got to try and hit a cluster of keys in the top left-hand corner to pick a weapon while you're trying to shoot. Whether they could have just simplified it to maybe change the spacebar option for the smart bomb and had that elsewhere on the keyboard, at least had space for weapon select, you could have always plugged a joystick in the other port and pressed the fire button with your foot or something like that. So it's decent. I certainly had good fun with it back in the day, but there is room for improvement, I would say.
Yeah, once again, I agree mostly with what you said there. The one thing I want to mention about this game, though, is the cover art. What is going on there? I mean, it looks like a Ghostbusters game if you base it on the cover art. Clearly, the person doing the cover art was given the brief that the game was called Poltergeist and drew their own conclusions about what kind of game it was. That was very strange. But moving on from that, the game itself, as you say, good fast-paced scrolling shooter, very reminiscent of a game like Defender, I thought. And the idea that you've got to shoot the boxes and carefully navigate through the landscape and then land on the landing pad is quite original. It's reasonably easy to begin with, but the difficulty curve does ramp up quite quickly, as you said, but you do get an extra life on each stage, so you've always got a fair chance of making a bit of progress. As you said, the power-ups are hit and miss. The three-way fire is pretty much the first one you get, and it's probably the best one. The vertical up and down only firing is just ridiculously bad and useless for the most part. Graphics and sound pretty decent, I thought. Plenty of variety in the backgrounds from one stage to the next, and the sort of inter-level status screen with a musical tuner and nice touch, although as you said, it would be much better if it has the score and other information on the screen when you're playing. Matt, what about your thoughts on this one?
Poltergeist. Yeah, it's bloody quick, isn't it? I think I played it briefly back in the day. Gavin Rayburn's the name I know from other budget titles, so reasonably reliable programmer. But yeah, it's blimmin' quick, and there's a lot of enemies on screen. Most of my thoughts, I have to say, probably echo both of yours, that the weapon selection is utterly horrendous, having to try to press keys 1 to 7 to pick your weapon, especially when you're trying to maneuver a joystick and press fire at the same time. But I suppose back in the 80s, that's what, you know, quick shot 2s, etc., with the fire button on the grip handle and rubber suckers on the bottom, were actually more designed to do. Emulation doesn't quite emulate a quick shot 2 in that regard.
Indeed.
But yeah, it's fast paced. It does get very difficult even after the first few levels, unless you're very, very careful and nudge your plane left or right to maneuver about. Yeah, Dave Whittaker tune, you know, decent, you know, nothing spectacular. So the reviews of the game that were in Zap, etc., were probably about accurate. The one thing I was going to touch on was something you mentioned there, Matt, was the cover art.
There is a reason for that, which can be seen via an entry on GameBase 64. The entry is called Real Poltergeist. It was made about a year earlier, it's got the same gameplay, but you play as a ghost, and the levels are a lot more maze-like. I can only think the cover art was possibly commissioned, and then someone, maybe at Codemasters, decided the game had to change to a standard shooter with a ship instead. So you can get the file at Gamebase and play it and see why the artwork is how it was.
Well, that's really interesting. Thanks for that. I'll definitely put a link to that page in the video description so people can check that out. Thanks guys for your thoughts on all 3 games. So now it's time to give them a ranking. So I'm going to ask each of you to rank them from 3rd place up to 1st, and we'll then allocate them some points and work out which of the games is considered to be the best. Warren, do you want to go first on this one?
Yeah, so 3rd for me was Sidewinder 2, so that's 1 point. 2nd was Poltergeist, 2 points. And top of the table in this one was Warhawk, so the 3 points go to that one.
Thanks very much. Matt, what are your points awarded for this particular round?
The British Jury Award, 1 point to Sidewinder 2, 2 points to Poltergeist, and funnily enough, 3 points to Warhawk.
Thanks very much, and it's exactly the same for me. I'm putting Sidewinder 2 in 3rd place, Poltergeist in 2nd place, and Warhawk in 1st, so we're in complete agreement about all these games. That means then that I can announce for the first round, in 3rd place with 3 points is Sidewinder 2, in 2nd place with 6 points is Poltergeist, and in 1st place with 9 points and winning the first round is Warhawk, so Firebird take an early lead. That was easy. Unanimous decision across the board.
Yeah, I mean, none of the 3 are really that bad either, to be fair. You know, all 3 were worth the money and were playable, but I think it was just a case of certain ones had better options than others, and as we've all agreed, Warhawk is a bit of a classic.
Yeah, I agree. They were all reasonable games. I'd have been happy to play any of them back in the day, I think. Actually a pretty strong start for this competition, and it will get worse as we go on for certain categories, I'm sure. But yeah, pretty good so far. Okay, well, round 1 went pretty well, for Firebird at least. So we're going to move on to round 2, which is other shooters, which basically means any other kind of shooter that isn't in space. It could be something that's based on the ground, it could be army vehicles, it could be some kind of abstract shooter. And the 3 games in this round representing Mastertronic is POD, Proof of Destruction, also known as POD. For Firebird, it's Trojan Warrior, also known as Odysseus on the title screen. And for Codemasters, we're looking at Sky High Stuntman. So first up, we're going to look at POD, Proof of Destruction, released by Mastertronic in 1987 for £1.99. This is a Mr. Chip software production developed by Sean Southern, and according to the inlay, POD has no pretentious storyline and no mega reality to justify its existence. It is simply an exciting and addictive shoot 'em up. You play across an interconnecting grid of wire along which your pod may be moved. The aliens descend rapidly, and blowing them away causes an explosion which will damage the grid. Neither you or the bad guys can move over the damage until it heals after a few seconds. Each level is timed, and to win through all you have to do is stay in one piece. Should you succeed, a bonus is awarded and an extra life granted. Every 4th level is a bonus screen which gives you the chance to increase your score further. POD was very positively received by the gaming press. In May 1987, Zap said it's a wonderful little shoot 'em up, highly polished and very playable, giving it 84%, while your Commodore magazine gave it 8 out of 10, saying it's a fun, cheap, addictive arcade game. What more do you want? So Warren, what are your thoughts on POD?
Oh, I absolutely adore this game. Disclaimer here, I am a big fan of Sean Southern games, so the fact that he programmed it was kind of an alert to sort of buying it originally. It's fast paced, it's frenetic, particularly in later levels. It really ramps up nicely in terms of its pace. When you shoot enemies and the grid breaks up, you've got to think tactically. You can't just blast everything, because if you do that, the enemies come spawning down because they've been hitting the shattered parts of the grid, so you've got to think a little bit as well. The baseline in game really drives you on lovely. It works really well. The enemies, although they're not massively animated, they've got variety, and different ways that they move means you've got to think of different strategy as well. And 2-player mode, playing this with a friend in 2-player mode is absolutely awesome. I used to play this with my brother many a time, and we could rack up decent scores and get to high levels, but the fact you could sort of play it together simultaneously was just an icing on a very, very good piece of cake that this game is. The only real negative I've got to say about this is that sometimes the colour cycling background, as nice as it is to give you a bit of colour, can sometimes obscure the bullets, and it would have been nice, for example, to have the option whether you wanted that on or off. Off would have resembled the original Commodore 16 version, which I also own and adore as well. But yeah, it's a real quality shooter. There's no pretense about it. It's just blast for fun, but also think tactically, and it's just a very, very good polished game.
Yeah, I couldn't really agree more with that. This game was number 6 in my top 10 Mastertronic originals when I did that video many moons ago. I see this as Sean Southern doing Jeff Minter, but maybe doing it just a little bit better in my opinion, and that might be a bit controversial. I think it's got great twitch gameplay with a variety of enemies to mix things up, as you mentioned. I like the idea of having a time limit rather than eliminating all the enemies to complete a level. That's quite original. There is a bit of strategy, as you mentioned, for some stages where it's perhaps safer to avoid the enemies and shoot just to complete the level. And the only thing I would say that's a little bit annoying about it is that you can lose lives on what's considered a bonus stage, which I would say is a little bit strange, because bonus stages typically are just to get a bonus and shouldn't really be being killed off in those. But other than that, it's a really good game, one of my favourite Mastertronic games, and a great shooter all round. Matt, how about you? What do you think of Pod?
Yeah, I love Pod. Played it to death back in the day. Have to echo Ozzy's sentiment about Get My Brother, playing it in 2-player as well. We hammered that an awful lot. And to be honest, there isn't too much more to add over what you guys have already said. I mean, it is Centipede, but with different mechanics, because the grid break is basically the same as shooting the centipede pieces and creating mushrooms, and as soon as the centipedes hit the mushrooms and they drop down another level, which is exactly what happens here, just that Pod is a bit faster, it's a lot more psychedelic a la Jeff Minter. You know, it's a classic, it's a great shoot 'em up. I don't think Sean Southern made a bad game ever for the Commodore machines. I just thoroughly enjoyed it, and yeah, hammered it to death back in the day. Cursed every time I got hit by a bullet I didn't see, but that was part and parcel of playing the game, and you accepted that. But I did actually manage to loop the game round back to the start at least once. That's how much I played it and got so in the zone with playing it that, yeah, it was just another one of those $1.99 titles where you could have charged more than $1.99 for it easily.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm impressed that you've managed to loop the game as well. I think about level 8 or 9 is probably my limit, but that's probably just my old man reflexes now. I never actually knew that you could play it simultaneous 2 players, so that's something I'm going to have to try and get someone to play it with me at some point and try out.
Am I right in thinking that the 2-player mode, you could actually push each other around on the grid? You couldn't actually move through each other, so you were actually limited where the other player was on the grid, so you could deliberately try and block each other out and such.
Yeah, I think you had the option. You could play cooperative if you wish, but you just have to be careful not to run into each other and kind of bump each other into enemies. But I think for most people, you try and stay on each side of the screen and just blast stuff or defend stuff as you needed and try and make it through the levels together and sort of get that real sense of achievement. I think my brother and I got to about level 20 in 2-player mode together, so we did pretty well, really. The 2-player mode is awesome, and it's definitely something that everyone should try out if they have a friend to hand to play as well. I should also add that for those who don't like the colour cycling background and want to play the game like the C16 version with a plain background, I do have a poke for that, so you can play it without the psychedelic colours should you wish to do so. And
we'll make sure we get that in the video comments as well. So let's move on to the Firebird choice for this round, which is Trojan Warrior. This was a Silverbird packaging released from 1988, costing £1.99. It's a horizontal scrolling shooter developed by the Highlanders with music from Steve Barrett. A mysterious horseman who rides a winged stallion has come from another time and place to save a princess whose awesome magical powers are being used against her will for the forces of evil. Shoot creatures to gain extra weapons and collect flashing pods to add to your existing weapons. Enter the time tunnel at the end of each stage to travel to the next level. In terms of review scores for this one, Zap gave it 74%, saying a Greek mythological shoot-'em-up jaunt with lots of playability, while Commodore user said it's unoriginal, plain and occasionally annoying but entertaining nonetheless, and gave it 6 out of 10. This is a game that is in my top 10 Firebird budget originals. The main thing I can say about this game is that the main player sprite is absolutely massive, and it's really quite annoying how big it is at times, but also the animation on it of the wings of the horse flapping is really nicely done, really well animated. It's got some pretty nice background graphics, some interesting enemies. I noticed some that seem to be inspired by other Commodore 64 games such as Gribbly's Day Out and Whizball perhaps. In between levels, when you're sort of dodging the scenery, going through those glowing sort of tunnels, that's quite a nice addition and adds a little bit of variety to the normal shooting sections. It's got some nice music on there as well that sort of propels you along. The gameplay on this one though is rock hard, especially after the first stage, and I found it borderline impossible after stage 2, which is why for the video that you're seeing while I'm talking about this, it's got an infinite live sheet to show the later stages. Overall though, I think it was a good game, probably not quite as good as I originally rated it in my Silverbird video, but still a decent game that made my top 10.
first encounter with Trojan Warrior was actually a remix of what is a very nice Sid title screen track, and it was kind of like, well, I haven't heard of this game. So I probably first played the game maybe 15 years ago, sort of during the 2000s. It's basically Nemesis with a horse, a big, white, very well animated horse, but it's Nemesis with a giant horse, which isn't a bad thing, but I will say it is, reasonably derivative. It doesn't do anything new, but it's well put together. As you say, yeah, it does get very, very hard after the first level. The bonus bit where you have to guide yourself through kind of reminded me a little bit of a side-scrolling version of having to go through the warp gates between levels in Encounter. It's kind of similar to that. But yeah, it sounds nice, it plays well, it's rock hard. I couldn't really ever figure out a way of being able to shoot the wizard guys on the ground that ping bullets at you. I'm not sure whether I was missing something, but I never worked out how to be able to do that, even on playing it again recently for this. It does what it says on the tin, and it's probably, your standard 7 out of 10 title that you wouldn't begrudge paying your £2 for.
Yeah, absolutely. Some of the enemies on it are crazy. Like those volcanoes, the first time you come across them, or there's like some dragons that kind of go up and down in a sort of S formation. You've got to sneak over the top of them, I think. They're just absolutely crazy difficult. But yeah, I think overall it was a pretty entertaining game, worth the money, as you say. So Warren, what are your thoughts on the Trojan Warrior?
I've got to agree with you on the main character, the actual horse. It's really well animated. Yes, it's large, but they really thought about that well, which is nice. You do get some decent weapons later on. The minus point of that, of course, is that when you lose a life, you do lose all the power-ups. So it then becomes really hard to try and get them back again, particularly in later levels, where, as you both already have said, the difficulty ramps up massively. The bonus stage has a nice little extra tune as well that sort of builds up in speed as the tunnel builds up in speed as well. So it does become more frenetic the closer you get to the end of that sort of bonus stage. The tune by Steve Barrett on the title screen is actually a reworking of a tune he first released on CompuNet called Cry, but it's a really nice title theme and sets the tone well. But yeah, basically those volcanoes, the first time you encounter them, you will inevitably lose all your lives as the sort of thing spew out of the volcano at you, and is extremely unfair. I just think if they'd have tweaked the difficulty level a little bit just to make it you got further with each go, this could have been an 8 or 9er. As it is, it's a decent quality shooter. I wouldn't have begrudged paying the $1.99 for it at the time, but there are possible room for improvement to be made.
Yeah, I think if they're giving you a shield, even if it was a limited shield that you could hit spacebar and it lasted for a few seconds, something like that would have really helped on those stages, at least until you got to grips with how to get through them. But yeah, overall, not a bad game, but as you say, definitely some room for improvement. So let's move on to the final game in this round, which is Sky High Stuntman, released by Codemasters in 1991 for the price of $3.99 at this point. Obviously budget games did go up in price towards the end of the Commodore 64's commercial life. This is a vertical scroller that was coded by Nick Taylor with graphics from Jason Brazil and music from Lyndon Shaw. As the Sky High Stuntman, you've been hired to shoot another mega action movie by the top director Steven Spielberg. To get the scenes right, you must complete 4 death-defying stunts, each more terrifying than the last. Fly through each level to the end and land your aircraft. After each level, you'll proceed to the next movie, and you get 5 takes to get the scene right. Destroy as many of the enemy as you can to make the most of the movie, but use the smart bombs wisely as there aren't many. This one got mixed reviews from the gaming press. Zap said that Sky High Stuntman is little more than an ordinary everyday shoot 'em up with the Stuntman theme adding nothing to the gameplay whatsoever. It's not a disaster, but there are better games to spend your money on, and they gave it 65%. Commodore Format, on the other hand, were much less complimentary, saying it's a bit of a silly way to do a shoot 'em up and it's not even a very good one, and they gave it 25%, going on to say it's a bit of a box office flop. Matt, your thoughts on Sky High Stuntman?
Well, where to start with this, really? I will say that this is another one of the few that I hadn't encountered before, probably due to the review scores. And like Poltergeist, it's again another suffering of, well, what in the blinking hell has the game got to do with the artwork and the title? Well, it doesn't really, because it's just a general vertical scrolling shooter with a vague sort of film premise to it, that instead of lives, you have takes. But everything else is just a standard kind of like Tiger Heli clone, where the first level we have a helicopter that you're shooting stuff down. At no point, like the title screen, are you actually leaping out the helicopter or you're doing anything like that. When you get to the second level, which is a hot air balloon, then you discover that the game really has teeth, and you start having to employ different tactics to be able to get through without being constantly killed, because the balloon moves incredibly slowly and the firing mechanic is incredibly fiddly. I actually managed to cheat slightly in working out how to get through that level and get to level 3, but graphics are all right, sounds all right, but it's just boring, repetitive shooter really for me that didn't do anything massively surprising. And for $3.99, you're probably paying double what it possibly could have even been worth.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, I agree with some of those points. We'll get onto my thoughts in a moment. But Warren, what were your thoughts on it?
Well, if I was a Zap reviewer, I would be doing the sort of head into hands thing, basically saying it was kind of deserving of the lowest of the 3 Zap faces. Yeah, there's 4 different levels and different craft to use, and I get the idea behind the takes being a sort of different premise to lives, but there's no power-ups. Some of the bullets seem really ineffective. The enemy bullets are also faster than yours, so you instantly get a lot of deaths because of that, because you can't react in time. The balloon level 2, the mechanics are dreadful, because you move the crosshair trying to move towards the enemies to shoot them, but then you inevitably end up moving the balloon at the same time towards the enemies as well, so you're really kind of restricted as to what you can do. The music actually only plays once on the title screen. The next time you play the title screen after you've inevitably lost all your lives, it doesn't play again, so there's clearly a bug there. And the pauses in between the takes, it takes too long to sort of get back into the action afterwards. You're waiting for all this action cut, etc., that you can't skip. The gameplay is kind of broken up by these pauses and waits. So I didn't rate this highly at all, I have to say. It was probably the weakest game I've played for quite some time.
Yeah, I have to agree with a lot of what you said there. I do like the idea of it with each stage being in a different kind of vehicle and having the takes rather than the lives. I think that's quite clever and original, but the implementation of it is not very good. It's a very mundane vertical scrolling shooter. It's not really got that many enemies. You go through areas where there's virtually nothing going on, but they've all got these vicious homing bullets that nearly everything kills you the first time you encounter it until you work out where everything is. It's very much a memory test. The one thing that was quite interesting, I thought, was these sort of mid-level boss battles where you can kind of try and shoot it and destroy the big boss and get extra points for the great action shot, as it describes it, if you want to risk losing the lives or takes, or you can just kind of avoid the bullets and just go past it. So that's quite unusual. The hot air balloon level, again, it's quite unique, but it is really hard, as you mentioned. It should have been the last stage, really, based on how hard it is, because the stages afterwards were easier, I think. I found the key to that was to stay near the top of the screen and try and shoot stuff as soon as it came on. But again, it's just a memory test like the other levels.
That's exactly what I did, by the way. Stay at the top of the screen and waggle left or right to shoot left and right.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I did as well. The graphics wise, it was okay. The sound's really basic. The whole thing just seems a little bit unfinished or not very well tested. So yeah, it was an interesting idea, quite nicely presented, but definitely boring in the end. It wasn't really much fun to play. So that brings the second round to an end. So let's go to the rankings for this one. So Matt, do you want to go first, giving us your choices in reverse order from worst to best, please?
Sure, although I have a funny feeling we're all going to agree again here.
Me too.
Yeah, Sky High Stuntman in third, Trojan Warrior in second, and Pod in first.
Okay, well, I'm just going to say mine's exactly the same as that. So Warren, what about you?
I would also concur it would be the same for me as well. So Sky High Stuntman gets Solitary Singleton 1, Trojan Warrior the 2, and Pod the 3. If there was a joke around and it's a knockout, I would have probably nominated Pod for double. That's how much I love this game, but definitely Pod top of the list.
Yeah, well, we're all agreed on that. I think we'd all probably do the same, but let's not bring jokers into this now, because I hadn't thought of that up front. So great, again, we're in total agreement. So that means that Sky High Stuntman takes third place with 3 points, Trojan Warrior takes second place with 6 points, and Pod takes first place with 9 points. So that's a win for Mastertronic, and it'll go to the final round for us to see how things pan out in there and see if we can actually get any difference of opinion. So let's move on to the third and final round for this episode of the show, and that's run and gun games. So this is any game where you run with a gun and shoot stuff. So the 3 games we're looking at here: for Mastertronic it's Rapid Fire, for Firebird it's Combat Crazy, and for Codemasters it's SAS Combat Simulator. So firstly we're going to look at Rapid Fire. That was a 1987 release by Mastertronic, costing £1.99, and this is a horizontally scrolling run and gun program by John Buckley. An abandoned warehouse is being used as a hideout by a notorious gang of criminals. As an undercover cop, you must find a way into the warehouse, deactivate the computer systems, destroy the building and eliminate any criminals you come across. In order to do this, you must reach the master level of the building where the central power electrode is stored. However, before you reach the master level, you must negotiate the preceding 5 levels. On each level there's a plasma computer which must be deactivated before you can go any further. Commodore User Magazine gave this 6 out of 10 and said, if you fancy an hour or two of blasting and you're not of a nervous disposition or a prospective psychopathic maniac, this could be the game for you. Your Commodore magazine were even more complimentary. They said it's really addictive and quite frustrating, and for a humble £2 you can't go wrong. And amazingly they gave it 9 out of 10. Matt, I think we go to you first on this one.
It's an interesting game, I will say. This is the third out of the games that we're looking at that I hadn't actually really played before. So I didn't really know what to expect when firing it up. And it's pretty much Kung Fu Master with a gun, which is no bad thing because I actually really like Kung Fu Master. It's just, a bit different sort of running and gunning with a gun rather than using your fists and your feet. But once you get through each of the levels, it's pretty obvious that they have looked at the arcade machine, and the enemies and the layout and the things that are happening are actually really based on what the arcade machine does with its grunts and flying objects on level 2, and the fact you have an energy bar that depletes when you get hit. It's all very reminiscent, and it's not an outstanding title. There's some nice sound effects, the main player is reasonably well animated, backgrounds are pretty boring to be fair, there isn't an awful lot going on there generally. You play the game, you sort of learn how the mechanics work, and it's of that ilk that every game, you're able to work out what you need to do to get round each enemy, and you can get a little bit further every single time. So it works. I wouldn't necessarily go as far as saying it was a 9 out of 10 title, but it's certainly a decent, solid 7er for your money there.
Yeah, I agree with many of those points, but let's first hear what Warren has to say about it.
Yeah, I got mixed feelings about this one, primarily because, as Matt said, it's basically Kung Fu Master mechanic with a run and gun shooter. One thing which was quite nice was the fact that your gun temperature would overheat, so you just couldn't fire at will. You had to actually think about what bullets you were firing when to make sure that didn't overheat and you couldn't fire at all. There is a gradual increase in difficulty level, although on the minor side of that, if you do die, you end up going virtually back to the start of a level, which does seem a bit unfair on that one. From level 3 onwards, you get the overhead enemies that you've got to look at and shoot, and there's a bit of coordination needed to keep your eye on those as well, which is quite nice. The music is awful. It just sounds like somebody's randomly put some notes together and tried to make it a tune. It doesn't really add anything to it at all. Graphically, maybe needed a bit of improving. Even at that price range, it's a little too basic and dull in parts. And some of the enemies sometimes also appear at random, which doesn't help in later levels where you're trying to work out a strategy either. So as I said, I got mixed feelings on it. It's decent enough, and there's plenty of playability in there, but there's so much more they could have done to improve the quality of the title, really.
Yeah, again, between you've said pretty much everything I was going to say. I'm just going to mention firstly the cover of this game, which is so obviously Rambo that, well, nowadays it would be a copyright infringement, but no one really worried about that back in the 80s. What I did notice when looking at all 3 covers for these run and gun games is they're very similar. They've got a gun-toting hero shooting his machine gun and lots of explosions, so that was obviously a well-used trope taken from sort of action film posters and things like that. And the other thing I wrote down to say about this was I called it Gun Fu Master, so I obviously agree with the points you've made about it being a Kung Fu Master clone. Also, the main sprite is definitely not Rambo though. When you look at him, it seems to be like a balding middle-aged guy in a camo suit. It's a bit of a strange drawing they've done for the head of the guy, but other than that I think you've pretty much summed up everything I said. The only other thing I quite liked was being able to shoot grenades out of thin air and dodging the fireballs. There's a bit of variety to the levels. The strange sort of computer you have to shoot at the end is a bit of a weird addition. I thought, like you guys, sort of mixed feelings about it. Didn't think it was terrible, but it wasn't amazing either. What I will say though is that 9 out of 10 rating from your Commodore, that was a bit too generous, but at the end of that review they said buy this game or your arms will fall off. I'm not really sure what they were going on about there. Okay, so that was Rapid Fire. Let's move on to Combat Crazy, also known as Warbringer, and this was a 1988 Silverbird release, again costing £1.99. This is a multi-directional scrolling run and gun game developed by Power Slave with music from Jero and Tell of the Maniacs of Noise. You're the last remaining member of a highly classified assassination squad. Your long and dangerous mission is to fight your way through to the heart of the Warbringer's domain. On each stage you must find 2 parts of a remote controlled H-bomb which will allow you to open up the exit to the next stage. Enemy forces have been alerted to your presence and you have only 16 minutes to battle your way through each level. Surprisingly, this one didn't get any reviews in the magazines that I could find. Warren, do you want to start us off with this one?
Yeah, so I actually quite like this game, I've got to say. For a budget game, the fact that it's got various multi-load levels, and the levels are huge. It's not a game you're going to complete very quickly. You know, there is longevity of missions to complete. The soundtrack from Jerome Tell, particularly on the title screen, really sets the mood well, and that is really enjoyable. Lots of blasting action, and lots of enemies and power-ups to take care of along the way. The arrows that direct you throughout the levels do help a bit, so you've got an idea of which way that you're trying to go to get through to the end. They give you credits as well, which is quite nice, so at least you've got the option if you want to progress a bit further in the game and see a bit more with the credits you've got left. You're not thinking, I've got like 2/3 of the way through the first level and I'm dead, I've got to start again. You can at least use a continue there. The minus point really on this game is the leap of faith that you have to make, where you can't see where you're landing and you end up inevitably hitting spikes that will kill you. And that can be really annoying. I mean, a little tweak of the design there would have improved things considerably. And there's also no way of telling which of the bridges that you run over collapse and which don't. So you end up running over one, not realising it's collapsed on you, and you're dead. So it's a great amount of playability in terms of the size of the levels and the fact that you can shoot lots of things at will very easily. And with a couple of tweaks, I maybe was looking at what would have been possibly Zap Silver medal material at the time, but those little flaws just make it a sort of 7, 8 out of 10 game, but still a reasonably good game to buy.
Again, I pretty much agree with everything you've just said. This is another one that I've put in my top 10 Firebird budget originals. As you said, it's very impressive in terms of a technical achievement. It's got huge levels, smooth scrolling, loads of sprites and projectiles being thrown around the screen as well. It all moves at a good pace, and it's got a sort of arcade game feel, as you said, because of the continues, and the title screen presentation is very much like an arcade attract mode. And much like you, I think the negatives, the relentless respawning enemies, collapsing platforms and blind drops onto spikes do get really annoying, and I would say the levels are too big really. It just gets a bit tedious working your way through them. That sounds like quite a harsh criticism for a game that I put in my top 10, because overall I still think it's an absolute top tier budget game for its time. When I was a kid I would have loved a game like this. I never played it when I was a kid, but I would have spent ages on it because it's huge, you can run around shooting stuff. I just think it's a really good game for its time. Nowadays it's probably not aged especially well, but in its time I think it would have been really good. Matt, your thoughts on this one?
Not much different from what both of you have said, really. I mean, you get really large sprawling levels, which certainly doesn't mean that you're going to complete it too quickly. But as you say, once you get past the first couple of levels, you're kind of thinking, you know, it's going on and on and on a bit. There's a balance between how big you make them and how difficult you make them, and the sense of achievement of actually getting to the end. But you certainly get an awful lot of actual game for your money. It did vaguely remind me a little bit of Bionic Commando, just without the bionic arm. It's got that sort of vibe with the enemies and the levels and the exploration and trying to work out where you've got to go to get to the end. But similarly, to agree with, was the fact that occasionally you have to make these jumps, and if you don't know the level, you can't see some of the hazards that you might actually land onto and then die. And in terms of the bridges, I ended up randomly jumping as going along the bridges, just in case they were ones that were actually going to collapse. So if it did, then I'd automatically be leaping back up in the air again and hopefully not falling to my death in the process. Other than that, yeah, nice graphics, good scrolling, sort of large play field area that you get. Not one of these where the status area is taking up half the screen and you've got this tiny area to work out where you're going. So yeah, pretty solid title. Just a bit bizarre that no magazine actually picked it up and reviewed it back in the day.
Yeah, absolutely. I definitely got those Bionic Commando vibes from it as well. Certainly the size of the sprites was very similar to Bionic Commando, and the sort of jungly sort of layouts and things like that made it very reminiscent. Let's move on to the final game of this round and the final game of this episode, and that's SAS Combat Simulator, a Codemasters release from 1989 that cost £2.99. This one was developed by Jamie Irvine and Peter Goldsmith of Vision Software, with music from Steve Barrett. Fight your way single-handed through the hordes of enemy troops. There are 4 areas to assault on your way to the rebel leader, each with a huge overhead section and a fast action side view hand-to-hand combat game as you make your offensive on each enemy installation. I could only find the one review of this game from the magazines back in the day. Commodore Force gave this a small review as part of a compilation that was released in 1993, and they described it as an inferior Commando / Ikari Warriors clone. Not the best example of the genre, but you can get some fun out of it. They gave it 62%. This is quite obviously a clone of two arcade run and gun classics, Commando and Green Beret, but nowhere near as good as either of them from my perspective. The overhead view sections are okay, it's sometimes quite hard to get the shots on target to hit the enemies. I like the fact they scroll horizontally and vertically, and also there's the nice touch in the later levels where you move quite slowly through water, so it kind of gives you a sort of environmental feel to it, I suppose. Then you move on to the side-scrolling levels that are between each of the overhead view levels, and these are just an absolute blatant rip-off of Green Beret, even down to the backgrounds and the music, but they're absolutely rock hard, requiring pixel-perfect timing, and all you've got is this pathetic knife that you can't even see. At least the guy in Green Beret had a proper knife that you could actually see whether it's going to make contact with the enemies. Why has he suddenly not got a gun? It was my first thing that I thought when you're wandering through there. I was like, is there a button I have to press to get the gun? And you can't even jump either, you literally just have to run at these people and try and stab them as they run towards you. So those levels are just awful. I noticed that the first level's massive, the first overhead view level is huge, but then the other later levels are much shorter, and it's like, did the programmers just get a bit bored making the levels, or really should one of those shorter levels have been the first one to get you into the game a little bit further? It's also very hard to get past the first stage without infinite lives, mainly due to that scrolling Green Beret rip-off level. I also found, I think it was level 3, I played this with a cheat by the way to get to the later levels. There's like a car power up that randomly appears some way through that, and you can drive around in a little red car. That was bizarre. Overall, not really impressed with this one. It looks nice, presentation's pretty good, but it's really quite a boring game, and I'm not really a fan of games like Commando anyway, so it wasn't really one for me. I found it really dull in the end.
I will say that with relatives and ancestors that have been in the armed forces, the title of the game is a little bit of a slap in the face, I will say. The first overhead level actually reminded me more of Crackdown, the Sega arcade game, rather than Commando. But I don't know if the arcade machine was actually out before this game or not. They were both 1989. It was certainly out before the conversion that US Gold did of the game to the 64. It just felt very, very similar to that. Touching on what I said about Combat Crazy status panels, there's a great big huge status panel here, which means that the scrolling area for the game, especially on the first level, isn't particularly large. And then once you get past that, as you say, the Green Beret style level with just a knife, maybe you ran out of bullets or something, I don't know, just seems very unfair for exactly the same reasons you mentioned, that you can't jump. You're literally having to sort of touch people and hope they die. You haven't got a Crocodile Dundee-like knife.
Yeah.
Call that a knife? Now that's a knife.
Yeah.
You've got a knife more like the guy that's trying to face up to him rather than Crocodile Dundee's knife. And all in all, nothing about it really appealed to me. And as I said, just the title of it just felt like a bit of a slap in the face. The only way that it was really going to be SAS Combat Simulator was if it suddenly made the Commodore spurt globules of blood at you while you were playing.
Yeah, I wasn't very keen on the title either, and I feel like that's not really what SAS Combat was about anyway. I'm not an expert on the various armed forces, but I felt like SAS work was probably a bit more stealthy than this, but I don't know. But yeah, not a good title for a game. There was a few Codemasters simulators that were a bit inappropriately named, I think. So to round things off, Warren, your thoughts on this one?
So some of the criticisms that you mentioned, I definitely would agree with. The sort of Green Beret type section is rock hard, and the collision detection is not great. The military drums that play in the game is so much of a rip-off of the Martin Galway drums from Green Beret, arcade conversion as well. So I was like, oh yeah, this is the same, but not as good. If they'd have concentrated more on the first part of each level, that was actually not too bad, because you could at least work out the best route from the level design to a degree. You could also at least hold down fire for the use of a grenade, so you weren't reaching for the space bars. At least they thought about the design that you might want to use the grenades at certain points, which is quite good. The title music's decent as well, although it is a sort of remake of Steve Barrett's own music for a Mastertronic game called Pulse Warrior. there's a plane that flies overhead on the opening stage and it kills you without no chance of avoiding it.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
That design, somebody should have looked at that and gone, actually, this doesn't work. Let's just like give you an option to dodge it. So there's clearly some playtesting needed there on that one. But yeah, you're like, oh, I'm dead. Great, that's a life loss.
Yeah, and why is a plane flying over me killing me anyway? Shouldn't it be a bit higher up?
Yeah, or even if it was a runway that it was going to land on, you could kind of excuse it a little bit. But yeah, I mean, it's a shame really, because this is definitely a game of two parts, where the sort of Ikari Warrior stroke commando bit in the first part of each level is not that bad. If you had that as a standalone game with 5 or 6 levels of it, you wouldn't begrudge it as much, to be perfectly honest. But the Green Beret sections, they are doable, but you've really got to be absolutely pixel perfect, and it needs quite a bit of practice, even on the first level of that. Yeah, they just needed some additional playtesting, really.
If you never got to that Green Beret stage, you'd probably think it's a good game, just quite hard. But when you get to that stage, it's just so unfair and really boring as well. You just literally run from left to right trying to stab people. It was strange that they tried to chuck that in there. It just didn't seem to add anything to the game at all.
It's what I call a wall denter, as in you're throwing the joystick at the wall every time you die.
Yeah, that's fair. I could see me smashing a few joysticks if I played that without an infinite lives cheat to get past it. Okay, well that rounds off the final round, so let's move on to the scoring for this one, and I'll go first this time. I suspect we may have similar opinions again here, but maybe we'll get some variation. So in third place I'm going to go for SAS Combat Simulator, second place Rapid Fire, and first place and the 3 points go to Combat Crazy. Matt, what about you on this one?
Yeah, pretty similar on that. It's going to be SAS, and then Rapid Fire, and then, not saying it's head and shoulders above everything, but it's the best of the 3, Combat Crazy.
Indeed, I agree, obviously, because I've already just said my results. And Warren, how about you?
I've got a very slight difference of opinion here. I would probably put Rapid Fire at the bottom with 1 point, purely because I found it a little bit dull. SAS Combat Simulator gets the 2, just about gets the 2. If I could have given them both 1.5, maybe that would have been an option. But Combat Crazy is the easy winner in this one, and it's the 3 points from that from me.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So that means for the final round, the run and gun round, third place goes to SAS Combat Simulator, second place goes to Rapid Fire, and first place goes to Combat Crazy. So for this particular episode, we've had 2 wins for Firebird and 1 for Mastertronic. So with this first episode completed, let's take a look at the leaderboard as it stands after 3 rounds. And in third place with 13 points is Codemasters. In second place with 17 points is Mastertronic. And currently in the lead with 24 points is Firebird. So Firebird taking a pretty healthy lead into the second episode, where things will probably change quite a lot based on what games are in that episode. Thanks very much guys for your opinions on those 9 games across 3 rounds, and to bring this episode to a close I'd like to ask you a few questions. The first question I want to ask you is, are there any games from the 3 publishers that you'd have chosen instead of the ones I did for the categories we've covered? I've gone for what I think was the best game in each category for each publisher, but you may not agree. So Matt, what are your thoughts about any alternative games?
Well, we had an interesting discussion about that prior to recording in terms of game selection, whereby you pointed out that you weren't picking any arcade conversions, for example. So had there been that allowed, I probably would have gone for Gapless as Mastertronic's space shooter, because that's an excellent Ash and Dave conversion of the third in the series, which is not really as well known compared to Galaxian and Galaga. It was an excellent conversion, and it did everything right, and there's a huge multiplex going on, massive sprites flying around the screen, so yeah, that was really well done. Or I might have picked Jeff Minter's Void Runner, his first entry into Budget Land. Jeff does what Jeff does, and it's frenetic, blasting, chaos, colourful, doing everything. In terms of Mastertronic and other entries, I might have actually gone for LA SWAT for the run and gun title, which I definitely put into the so cheesy it's good category. Well, Firebird wise, I might have picked Slime Is Mine. For the other shooter, another Simon Pick budget classic loaded with challenge and copious speech samples. I really enjoyed that, and Zap's 94% rating I think for it and a silver medal was pretty much bang on the mark, as I got hours of enjoyment out of that. Codemasters wise, I might have picked Super Tank Simulator for the other shooter, But to be fair, what we got was probably much for muchness between the two, so I don't think it possibly would have scored any more than third place anyway compared to the other two.
Yeah, I did have a try of that, but rotational controls are just a no-no for me, so I had to discount that almost immediately. I think I played it for about 15 seconds, and as soon as I saw it was rotational controls, like, nope. I did give it obviously a fair crack of the whip for those 15 seconds. Warren, any other alternatives you could have thought of for these three categories?
I think I agree with Matt on this, actually. If arcade conversions were allowed, and there weren't many budget arcade conversions, to be perfectly honest, I would have also gone with GAP Plus as well. I mean, it only ever got a 64 release as well as a conversion. It didn't get any other format releases, but it's a spot-on conversion, lots of levels, difficulty, lots of extra weapons to be gained, really nice drone tell music. That's a quality shooter. I'd have probably gone for that in the space shooter, maybe above Sidewinder 2. But that's probably about the only one I'd amend, to be honest.
Yeah, I agree Gap Plus was an excellent game, and if I was including arcade conversion in this series, then it definitely would have been the pick for Mastertronic. But I thought the main focus should be on original sort of homegrown games rather than ports of arcade games where they were just recreating someone else's idea. So that was my reasoning for excluding those. Thanks very much, guys. There are a couple of games I was considering for these rounds, but they didn't quite match up to the ones that I eventually chose. One of those is Panther. That was a Mastertronic release in the Entertainment USA packaging, kind of a cross between Zaxxon and Choplifter, I'd say. It's got an isometric perspective, but rarely for me it's actually an isometric game I enjoy. But I wasn't quite sure which category it would go into. It's kind of spacey in as much as you're fighting aliens, but it is kind of also ground-based, which would put it into the other category, and it definitely wasn't good enough to bet a pod. Another game worth a mention that could have gone in the run and gun round for Firebird is Star Slayer. That was a release in the $2.99 Silverbird packaging. It's a run and gun game with a little bit of strategy involved. I was quite impressed with this when I played it and put it in my top 10 Firebird games, but it's not quite as good as Combat Crazy in my opinion. So we've looked at 9 games today. Out of the 9 games we've reviewed, which one would you say is an absolute must play that everyone watching this video should be playing without fail? We could all just say it simultaneously, couldn't we? I think, but I'll just say...
I don't know.
Oh, okay.
I don't know.
Well, I'll just say that mine would be Pod. Any other alternatives you want to come up with?
Well, I know Woz is going to say Pod. I'm going to say Warhawk.
Okay.
But I will stress that it is a very close run thing between it and Pod. The two games there are head and shoulders above all the other 7 by a long shot, really.
Yeah, I totally agree. Woz, have you got any other thoughts there, or was Matt right? You were going to pick Pod?
He's right, I am going to pick Pod. To this day, it's still a classic budget shooter. Playability, frenetic action, 2-player mode, the iconic baseline. It is a budget classic. The other one, I would have also gone with Warhawk as well. Basically, if you are looking for a budget game and you're scouting around eBay and you want a shooter, then get Pod or get Warhawk in that order. They're both superbly playable even now. Buy both of them.
Absolutely, and you can probably pick up both of those games for less than $5. Okay, so one final question to both of you. Having seen what's happened in this first episode, which publishers do you think will win this competition overall? Will it be Mastertronic, Codemasters or Firebird?
There are some really good original Massatronic games that will probably crop up in the later episodes, I would imagine. So if there are Sean Southern games or Tony Keller games, I Missed a Chip, or some other decent published games that are some good puzzlers in there as well, Massatronic may still win out, but I think it's going to be close. I don't think there's going to be much in it between the 3.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think it is going to be close on the balance of play, but I think Firebird may just edge it overall based on the games that are up for discussion. But all the episodes don't have me and Woz passing judgments, so people may well have completely different views to some of them compared to both of us.
Absolutely, although we will be getting both of you back for episodes in the future, so you're still going to have a say in the final result. So that rounds off the first episode of the Commodore 64 Budget Publisher Showdown. I want to thank Matt and Woz for spending the time with me talking about these games. Any final comments from yourselves before we round things off?
I think it went pretty much as I expected. Not too much difference of opinion between us. Maybe that will be different in future episodes, which usually prompts a bit more of discussion. We can't all agree on everything, and it's nice to disagree. It's usually finding that middle ground, or just a plain, sort of, I hated this, no, I love this. Who's right? Well, you both are.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's almost back to the halcyon days of Zap64 with their free reviewers and their opinions. You know, sometimes they all universally agreed, sometimes they didn't, and sometimes it would cause debate. But hopefully we've all given you a flavour of what we think out of the games that we reviewed, which ones proved to be decent and which ones proved to be not so decent. So if you are looking to buy a budget game and you want to scour the listings online and think of something decent to play, hopefully we'll have given you some guidance as to what is good.
In terms of what was said about the Zap 3 reviewer opinions and not everybody agreeing with each other, the discussions that we have for the revamped Zap magazine, which is out bi-monthly, back it on Patreon or buy it on Fusion Retro. The discussions we have each issue, they probably go exactly the same, and we don't all agree on everything. You know, we do have some pretty vicious and opinionated discussions about some of the games that go into the magazines. So we're all friends and we all respect each other's opinions, but we do all have our own opinion, and people are going to differ. Everyone's got an opinion on a game, and you know, I'm sure there's some people going to look at us saying, oh, Pod was terrible. Well, let's say, what are you doing? Combat Crazy was an utter classic. I would hope sanity would prevail and most people are going to agree with us, but you just never know.
I think as well, though, it's always the case that sometimes you'll pick up a game, you'll instantly play it, and you'll grow to like it. Some games take longer to sort of appreciate when you start playing them. Certainly, you're not going to play, say, Combat Crazy for 5 minutes. You're going to do a 15-20 minute game at least on one credit before you run out of lives, potentially. So some of the games will have longevity more than others, but it's more about, are they playable? Are you going to be able to sort of pick these up reasonably quickly and get used to the mechanic of playing them all right or not? And for every decent budget game, there is also a not so decent budget game. There are some that just scoff at any budget game, and I think that's a bit wrong, to be quite honest. You know, there are some games that, quite frankly, could have been released at full price that had a $1.99 price tag on them.
Yeah, and we'll definitely be looking at some of those games in future episodes. That brings the first episode of this Budget Publisher Showdown to an end, with Firebird heading into the next episode with a healthy lead. If you have any thoughts on the games we've featured in this episode and the way we rank them, then please leave a comment. I'd also love to know which games you'd have chosen for these categories and which publisher you think will win this epic battle. Huge thanks to Matt and Warren for their time helping produce this episode, and please check out the links in the video description to see the other projects they're involved with. Next time around I'll be joined by 2 new guests and we'll be focusing on platform and maze games. Until then, thanks very much for watching and see you next time.